What's up, guys? So I was thinking it'd be cool to do a video today about UFC fighters who would have absolutely crushed it in different time periods. We're talking about random fighters from all kinds of weight classes who, in my opinion, would have been champion or at least top contenders if you drop them into the 90s, 2000s, or 2010s. I'll break it all down the best I can, so let's get onto it. Alright, first up on the list is Benoît St. Denis, and let me tell you this guy feels like he's in the wrong timeline. Everything about him, his look, his vibe, and especially his fighting style screams early 2000s. Honestly, it's like someone plucked him out of a Pride FC highlight reel and dropped him into the modern UFC. Now, hear me out, okay? I can easily place him in the UFC of the early 2000s, matching him up with legends like BJ Penn or Matt Hughes, and sure, that would have been great, but nah, forget that. When I look at St. Denis, I don't see a UFC octagon. I see him hopping on a plane to Japan and throwing him down in Pride. Picture this dude having multiple fights in one night, tossing guys around, throwing soccer kicks and stomps and knees to the head of the grounded opponent. Right there, that's St. Denis world right there. The early 2000s MMA scene was dominated by grapplers, especially in Pride, like Antonio Nogueira and Sakuraba Thrive. St. Denis would have fit right in there with the submission skills and top control. He's not the flashiest, but he's brutally effective, pinning guys down, grinding them down, and finding submissions when they least expected. And let's talk about his style. Aggressive, relentless, forward pressure. That's the kind of energy that makes Pride fighters fan favorites. While a lot of guys back then were still one-dimensional, either pure strikers or grapplers, St. Denis would have been a nightmare for them. He's not the cleanest striker, sure, his stand-up can look a bit rough, even ugly at times, but it's effective. He could outstrike grapplers and outgrapple strikers, making him a dangerous matchup for anyone in that time. And I'm not gonna lie, I wish he was born in that era because he would have had way more success back then. But honestly, I'm still glad we have Benoît in this timeline. He's fun to watch, even if he's not like top 10 material in the modern era. But anyways, moving on to the next guy on the list, Shamil the Blob Gaethje. This guy is unstoppable in any era, especially in the 2010s. He'll destroy Prime Kane and JDS. Obviously, I'm just kidding. Alright, for the real person that's on the list is Alexander Gustafsson. And before you say, wait, isn't he already one of the best light heavyweights ever? Yes, he is. Let me explain. Yes, Gus was a top tier fighter in his prime. But here's the thing. Being number 3 in your era isn't the same as being number 1. So let's take Prime Gus at his absolute best and drop him in today's light heavyweight division. Tell me he's not the champion. I dare you. When you look at this weight class today, you could argue it regressed a bit over time. And if Gus entered the mix as a well-rounded fighter that he was in his prime, he's running the table. His jab alone is a nightmare for most of the current roster. Add in his ability to string together combinations, and he becomes a serious problem, especially against guys who rely on single strikes or pure power shots. One of Gus's most underrated weapon is his footwork. He uses lateral movement to stay off the cage and avoid close range brawls, keeping opponents at a distance where he can pick them apart with clean shots. In a division where striking has become more about wild aggression or unpredictability, like what you see with guys like Alex Pereira or Yuri Prohaska, Gus' technical method boxing would absolutely stand out. He would dictate range, landing precise strikes, and avoid unnecessary damages, making him a nightmare match for pretty much anyone. Let's not overlook Gus's grappling. While it's not his primarily weapon, it's a valuable tool that he can pull off when he needs it. If he needs to combine it with the striking, heavy approach, he becomes even more of a bigger threat in this era. Against Alex Pereira, Gus' sharp striking and ability to exploit straight openings would likely overwhelm Pereira. Against Yuri Prohaska, Gus's clean techniques and superior defense would neutralize Yuri's chaotic style, making it a one-sided fight in Gus's favor. Now, Jamal Hill might present a tougher challenge, but Gus's master of range and his ability to mix in his grappling into this fight would likely give him the upper hand. A matchup with Magomed Ankalaev would be more of a chess match, but Prime Gus has the tools to adapt and outlast him using a mix of striking and defensive wrestling to tip the scales in his favor. The bottom line is a Prime Gus in today's light heavyweight division would be championship material. If Glover can be champion in this era, Gus would have definitely been a champion in this era. I'm telling you that right now. Alright, I want to add this man not because of the memes, but because on paper, it actually looks pretty good. So hear me out. Anthony Smith. in the early UFC 2000s. Now, I'm not saying he'll be guaranteed a champion in this era, but let's be real. He had a better shot at gold back then than he does in today's ultra competitive scene. Anthony Smith is a jack of all trades. He's not necessarily elite in any one area, but he's well-rounded enough to hang in there with just about anyone. And in the early 2000s, that can take him very far. Think about it. Back then, the sport was filled with specialists, guys who are either relied on pure wrestling, striking, or grappling. Smith, with his ability to mix things up, would have been a nightmare matchup for a lot of those fights. Sure, wrestlers like Randy Couture or Tito Ortiz might have been able to out-grapple him, but let's not overlook the fact that Anthony Smith could potentially knock out guys like Chuck Liddell, Tito, and even Randy. Take Chuck Liddell for an example. He was known for his aggressive counter-striking, but often kept his hands low, relying on that chin to absorb damage. Smith's precision and well-timed punch could have caught him clean in those exchanges. Then there's Tito Ortiz, whose striking defense was always a weak point because his game was so wrestling heavy. If Tito couldn't get Smith to the ground, he'd be in trouble standing up, where Smith could outstrike him and potentially finish the fight. And Randy Couture, while he was an elite grappler and a clinch fighter, his striking defense wasn't great either. Guys like Chuck Liddell and Vitor Belfort exposed that, and Smith, with his range and straight punches, could have done the same. And look, man, I'm not saying that Anthony Smith would have dominated or that he'd definitely win a belt, but if we're talking about opportunities, he would have a much better chance 20 years ago than he does in today's MMA. Remember when Smith said about John Jones, if you take away his reach, his kicks, his ability to wrestle, and his striking, he's not that good. That kind of mindset applies here. The fighters back then in the early 2000s didn't have the same well-rounded skill set as today. In that era, Smith's well-rounded and grit could have gave him a real shot to break through. Now, the next person we have on the list is Yoel Romero. Now, imagine if Romero had transitioned to MMA right after winning his silver medal at the 2000 Olympics, when he was just 23 years old, instead of the 35-year-old version we saw in the UFC. We'd be talking about a young, explosive, and injury-free athletic at his absolute peak. It's not far-fetched to suggest that this version of Romero could have been the greatest fighter of all time. Think about it. If Romero had entered MMA in the early 2000s, he could have dominated the middleweight division long before Anderson Silva's reign even began. Anderson's debut in the UFC in 2006. But by that time, Romero could have been the champion for years, racking up title defenses. The middleweight division historically wasn't the strongest, and Romero, with his athleticism, wrestling pedigree, and freakish physicality, would have bulldozed through the competition. Consider the timeline. If Romero started MMA around 2001, he could have been the champion by 2003 or 2004 and defended the belt 10 to 15 times before Anderson Silva even entered the scene. By that time Silva arrived, Romero might have been established himself as an unbeatable champion. Even if Silva posed a tough challenge, Romero's younger, faster, and healthier self, especially pre-neck injury, could have been too much for him. People forget that the Romero we saw in the UFC was post-neck injury. That scarred on his back of his neck is a reminder of a serious injury that significantly impacted his wrestling ability. In his prime, Romero's wrestling was unstoppable. Combine that with his athleticism, which was even more terrifying in his 20s. Like, imagine Romero going through the early 2000s middleweight roster like Rich Franklin, Dan Henderson, and the rest of Anderson Silva's opponents. It's hard to see any of them beating a prime Romero. Even in the Weidman and Whitaker era, arguably the strongest period for the middleweight division, Romero still beats many of the top guys late in his career, well past his physical prime. You see, when Romero debuted in the UFC in 2013, he was already 36 years old and only been fighting professional for 4 years. He missed out on the years where his speed, his strength, and his athleticism were at his peak. A 23-year-old Romero entering MMA would have wrestled far more and had explosiveness, would have been on another level. And if you ask me, it's fascinating to think about how his career could have been. With his physical tools and Olympic level wrestling, Romero could have broken every title record in MMA history. Even Anderson Silva would have had a hard time dealing with a younger Romero. You know, more wrestling heavy version of Romero. The version of Romero we got to see in the UFC was incredible, but it's hard to wonder what could have been if he started MMA in his early 20s. We might be talking about the greatest champion the sport's ever seen. Alright, the next fighter we have on the list is Justin Gaethje. You can't tell me that this guy wasn't made for the early 2000s. He's got that insane takedown defense and absolutely no BJJ to save the life for him. He's the definition of a one-dimensional fighter who somehow thrived in the modern era. Back then though, Gaethje probably would have ran through most of the division and probably ended up as the champion. Take Sean Shirk for an example. I think Gaethje stuffs all his wrestling all day and catches him with strikes. Honestly, most of those guys in those era wouldn't have an answer for his pressure and his leg kicks and his counter striking. But I'll admit, there are a couple of matchups that make me pause, like BJ Penn, because Penn's boxing and jiu-jitsu were next level for that time. Gaethje just feels like he was born in the wrong era. His style, his grit, it all screams early 2000s UFC. He would have been a fan favorite, no doubt about it. Alright, for the last person on the list, and hear me out, Cannonier in the early 2000s would have been a monster. I honestly think he could have been the first guy in UFC history to win titles in 3 different weight classes. Let's start with the heavyweight division. Back then, the division wasn't as deep or filled with massive athletic monsters like Francis Ngannou or Curtis Blades. Cannonier at around 5'11" at 240 pounds would have been less undersized compared to guys like Pedro Rizzo or Rodriguez. His power and his athleticism would have made him a real threat to those fighters, and he could have easily been a title contender. Now at 205, the competition was tougher, with legends like Tito Ortiz, Randy Couture, and Chuck Liddell running the show, but Cannonier's striking and durability would have made him dangerous. This was still a division leaning heavily on brawlers and wrestlers, and I think he could have made a serious run, especially during the transition period when the title picture wasn't as stable. Now, as for middleweight, this is where I think Cannonier would really shine. The division was still developing and didn't have the elite talent it saw later during the Anderson Silva era. Cannonier's power, athleticism, and overall skill set would have been way ahead of the curve, and I think he could have ran through most of the division and easily captured the title. The bottom line is, Cannonier's size, athleticism, and modern skill set would have made him a standout in the early 2000s, and there's a good chance he could have pulled off that insane feat of being the 3-division champ. Alright guys, that's my list. I know there's other fighters we could include like Ian Cutelaba or Bryce Mitchell, but I've been a bit pressed for time lately with everything going on. Still, I want to get this video out because I thought it would be a fun idea. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you guys have any other suggestions for fighters who could have had success in different eras, drop them in the comments down below. And if you liked the video, please leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And as always guys, I'll catch you guys on my next one.